Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to this exciting session on digital rights. I am Pauline de Wilde, and I'll be your host for the next hour. With further ado, let me introduce Nicola Kelly, who will be leading the discussion today. Nicola Kelly is press officer at Article 19, one of the leading organizations defending freedom of expression. But before giving you over to Nicola, we would like to make it interactive today. You can send in your questions by going to the Ask the Speaker function in the conference platform. You can submit a question, and a selection of which will be asked to the speakers in the last 10 minutes of this session. For now, let's go to Nicola, and let me see. Yeah, I can see you there, Nicola. It's all yours.
Pauline, Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to this panel discussion on freedom of expression. My name's Nicola Kelly. As Pauline said, I work for Article 19 as a media editor. I'm also a journalist for The Guardian and the BBC based in London. And for those who don't know, Article 19 is a freedom of expression NGO which works to defend two fundamental rights, the freedom to speak and the freedom to know. We're joined this morning by a panel of distinguished guests, including Irene Khan, the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression, Pedro Vaca Villarreal, the Special Rapporteur for freedom of expression on the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and Jürgen Heissel, the Director of the Office of the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media. If you'd like to tweet during the event, please do tag at UNESCO Now, which is the official account for World Press Freedom Day. Before we turn to the panel, we're going to see a very short video on why freedom of expression matters and what we can all do as citizens to ensure our rights are protected.
Expression is one of the most powerful tools we have. A voice, a pen, a keyboard. But many of those who hold power around the world want to deny people freedom of expression and the right to information that accompanies it. Our ambitious global strategy is called the Expression Agenda. It will help ensure that these freedoms are upheld. It details 5 key areas of impact. We want transparency to be at the heart of national legislation, so that people can hold governments and other powerful actors accountable for their actions. People should have the right to democratic participation, open debate and protest, whether they're gathered in their town square or online. We must make sure that freedom of expression and information are fully protected online and that people have unrestricted access to the internet. People must be able to engage with whatever media they choose, wherever they choose, and without fear of reprisal. And those who take great personal risks in exercising freedom of expression and information must be protected from violence and censorship.
So Article 19's Global Freedom of Expression report, which was just referenced in that video, shows that freedom of expression is at its lowest ever point, with the majority of people around the world now living in a country considered to be in crisis. Irene, do you agree with that assessment?
Of course, yes, I do. You know, freedom of opinion and expression, I call it a meta right with mega challenges, because it underpins a huge number of other human rights, whether economic and social, cultural, political, or civil. And therefore, the negative impact on freedom of expression reverberates across the human rights system. And what worries me extremely right now is the political climate, a climate in which we see the rise of authoritarianism, we see populist politics, and we see the shrinking of the civic space. We see the world's largest and oldest democracies challenging media freedom. That's an incredibly negative development. And at the same time, we have seen transformative digital technology advances, which of course opens up huge opportunities, but also carries big challenges. And on top of all that, of course, has been the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic, which has created lots of challenges across economies, societies, and politics. But it has also allowed some governments to take advantage of the COVID-19 restrictions and actually clamp down on freedom of expression. We've seen attack on the media, we've seen internet shutdowns, we've seen restrictive laws being introduced with negative impact on free speech. And we've seen instruments of technology like surveillance, track and trace being handed or being implemented across the board to protect us from the pandemic, from the virus. But when those types of tools get into the hands of law enforcement agencies, then it's very hard to get it back again safely. So there are huge challenges out there. And as I said, this pressure on civic society space. At the same time, I've been, I must say, encouraged by support from certain quarters. Certainly in the Human Rights Council, we've seen two positive resolutions, one on freedom of expression, one on the safety of journalists coming up. We've seen some governments looking at the issue very seriously. For example, the European Union's Democracy Action Plan, the new Digital Services Act. There are measures being taken there. Yes, there is a crisis, but I think there are also windows of opportunity that we need to take to deal with that crisis and the challenges.
Thanks, Irene. And Pedro, Irene mentioned there some of the challenges that COVID-19 has presented. Would you say in the region that you cover, the pandemic has made the situation better or worse, particularly when thinking of attacks against journalists?
So, first of all, good morning to all of you. It's an honor to be here, and thanks to UNESCO and Article 19 for making this possible. I mean, I think that the pandemic certainly adds another layer to the threats against journalism and media outlets. In the region, mainly in Latin America, most of the governments have claimed for extraordinary powers to attend the pandemic, and I think there are some reasons to do that. But also parliaments and the judiciary are not working at the same rhythm. So the rule of law is in some way deteriorated, and press freedom needs rule of law, and democracy needs effective checks and balances. So I think there's also something related to the structure of democracies that has had an impact from the pandemic. So this brings us to two dilemmas, I would say. The first one is that at the same time we need more journalism, the media sector is crossing through its worst financial moment. And at the time we need more journalists asking to state representatives to make accountable government, it seems that there's a trend of this access to information and this question and these interviews, there's a trend for them to be locked. So also in the region, we have the official voice having more space than ever, and the social and media control and balance is not as effective as before. It also gets into, another layer is that, the pandemic also is having an impact at the economics level, crossing in some countries through electoral context. So protests in the region are increasing. And we have another tension between the measures of self-care for the pandemic, like physical distancing, and the right to protest. And in a lot of countries, we've seen that. And I think this is a tension we have to look and to study in a deeper way. And finally, there's an atmosphere of violence. No? And this is previous the pandemic. No? Political leaders that goes to the denigration of media outlets, and this is the creation or the permission, at least, for further threats and attacks against journalists. Unfortunately, I have to say that violence has not gone to quarantine. We keep documenting cases of murders of journalists, threats against journalists, and the situation is very worrying at all.
Thanks, Pedro. And Jürgen, Pedro mentioned there some of the challenges, including physical attacks against journalists, but there are other aspects as well, aren't there? So we're looking at sort of different forms of state interference and other reprisals against journalists, including independent journalists. And looking at some of the areas you cover, is there anything that concerns you in particular?
Well, thank you, Nicola, and let me also start by thanking for the invitation. I'm really honored to be part of this panel today. I think this is a very broad question. I will therefore also try to limit myself to the context of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic to illustrate some of the concerns. And would like to start me with two important issues. And that is that I would like to first reiterate the position of the previous OSCE representative in relation to restrictions that journalists and independent media faced in their work during the pandemic. And that was that human health does not only depend on readily accessible healthcare, but just as much on the access to accurate information about the nature of the threats and the means to protect oneself. And it's therefore really important that states take steps to ensure an enabling environment for pluralistic and independent media, as well as educational settings that promote media literacy, that are providing individuals with critical thinking tools for the digital age. And secondly, another concern, and Pedro has already mentioned it, is that many media outlets are really struggling financially after those months of restrictions, which have resulted in huge losses in advertisement revenues. But we've also seen some states that have already reacted with economic relief programs, which could serve as positive examples. And I think this is really where we come in as multilateral fora, like the OSCE, where we can serve as a platform for the exchange of good practice and lessons learned. But now, coming to your question on other forms of state interference and reprisals, I think if we apply them to the content of information, we can probably break them down into three areas. One being the restrictions on access to information, where we have observed governments putting on hold all requests under access to information legislation about COVID-19 related policies until a particular date in the future. And as a result, even without formally changing the procedures, requests were not being answered within the required timeframes or at all. Secondly, bans on disinformation, where we've also observed a number of countries that have amended or introduced new legal provisions to criminalize the dissemination of so-called false information on the pandemic. In some cases, these bans went beyond mere pandemic-related information. So let me underline that even before the current COVID-19 circumstances, anti-disinformation laws were considered a problematic measure, including by previous OSCE representatives. And maybe finally, the monopolization of the information flow, which we have also seen according to OSCE analysis, where states have monopolized the flow of public health information by forbidding in law and policy that media publish information on COVID-19, such as statistics from sources other than those officially authorized by the government. So I think, this would be a list of some of those restrictions that I would like to share on this occasion. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think access to information is one of the things that everybody's noticed, particularly over the last year. And digital technologies have kind of really come to the fore. And they're now one of obviously the main ways that we can express ourselves freely and access information at the touch of a button. So that brings opportunities, but it also brings some problems for free speech. And if there's anything that 2020 has shown us, it's that digital technologies are, access to those technologies in particular, are very dependent on where you live. We've seen a huge wealth disparity, particularly in developing countries, and looking largely at the global south, where there's far less access to online platforms. Pedro, if we're only connected to those wealthy enough to be able to afford internet connection, what does that mean for freedom of expression and information? And do you think that has an impact in developing countries? And have you seen that over the last year during the pandemic?
So, I think that the starting point is that more than ever, the access to the right to free expression and the access to information, in this case, the access to technology, is a way to exercise other rights. I think this 2020 has shown to us that explicitly. Access to education passes through technology. Access to health passes through technology. Access, the right to labor and to work is passing through technology. So the question you raise is very important, because what happened with that huge portion of the population that is not connected. So the office I lead has expressed the concern of the serious limitation posed by the lack of internet access of the most vulnerable sector of the population. This limitation affects mainly indigenous communities, Afro-descendant population, women, children, among other groups. In this emergency COVID-19 pandemic, people's access to quality internet acquires a central role based on isolation and social physical distancing measures imposed by governments. Internet connection emerged as the predilect tool to continue with daily tasks that previously required in-person contact. So the challenge is not only how to connect, which is important, also the challenge is how to make it affordable for this huge portion of the population that is, their rights are being blocked or not guaranteed at the same level than others. But also, as Jorgen said before, how to use technology. No? Media literacy and digital literacy programs has to be started. We soon are going to launch, to present and to publicate a report about access to information in isolated areas.
And digital technologies also mean that our every expression online is being monitored and controlled by digital companies. And we've seen many examples of this over the last year. So Facebook, for example, says it knows you better than your family does, based on algorithms interpreting your likes, what you share, etc. Irene, how do you address some of those issues in your work? And what do you think we can do to ensure it doesn't hinder or even violate freedom of expression?
Well, my mandate actually covers freedom of opinion and expression. And that first part of it, the freedom of opinion, is of course directly relevant to the question that you have put there. There is very little understanding of freedom of opinion because there seems to be an assumption on our side over the years that opinion is what we are thinking about. It's about our thought and our mind, and that we have autonomy over it. Digital technology has actually challenged that concept enormously. As you pointed out, these platforms actually monitor what we think and then seek to manipulate that. Freedom of opinion under international law is absolute. That means no one can interfere with your thoughts. You have the right not to reveal your opinion. You have the right not to have your opinion manipulated. And you have a right not to be punished for holding your opinion. And yet, because of the way in which digital tech operates, of course, all that is now open. Now, what can we do about it? I think, first of all, we must demand that the same rights that we have offline be protected online. And we can demand greater transparency, including transparency of algorithms. And we can demand greater protection of data. I don't think we, as individuals, really understand how valuable our data is or even what our data is. So there is an element there of digital literacy. But on the side of governance, there is a huge responsibility to protect our data and to enforce transparency of algorithms on the digital tech platforms. And we, human rights advocates, need to start demanding questions about the business model. We've talked a lot about content management and so on, but we need to now look at the business model and put pressure on governments and on international organizations to address the business model and on the tech industry itself, the business model that they operate, where they're basically taking our data with or without our permission and creating systems that actually manipulate our behavior, manipulate our thoughts. And that's a very, very dangerous move against human rights.
And when we talk about freedom of expression online, we see restrictions against those who are critical of the government and other powerful actors in society. But we've also seen this year the ways in which digital technologies can help to bring often underreported stories to the fore. So, Jürgen, I wonder, in the OSCE region, where media has been heavily controlled by the government or media corporations, what opportunities do these digital technologies or online platforms provide for exposing injustices and bringing some of these untold stories to light?
Well, maybe to start with, I'm not sure whether the OSCE region is distinct from other global regions when it comes to control by the government or media corporations. And I'm looking towards my fellow panelists, and I'm sure they can really add a lot on this. But here are some thoughts on your question. I would say that online platforms definitely provide a whole range of opportunities when it comes to exposing injustices. They provide a platform for sharing results of investigation into government actions and activities, corruption issues, environmental crimes, human rights violations. And I think it was very encouraging to see that also the 57 participating states of the OSCE have just last week at the Ministerial Council adopted a decision on the fight against corruption, where they noted the central role of whistleblowers in this endeavor. New platforms and tools today equip practically everyone with the means to produce and share sound, text, and images. So the public is now participating in the news gathering and distribution through a growing number of alternatives to traditional media, therefore actively contributing to the public debate. So I think these new activities of open journalism allow for a different participation of the public, which was traditionally just observing the news process. And this is a very important change. The OSCE representative on freedom of the media, in order for OSCE participating states to fully comprehend the ramifications of open journalism, has called together policymakers, practitioners on several occasions to facilitate an understanding of the issues involved and best practices to ensure a free media environment. But at the same time, while diversity of views and media pluralism should be more evident today than ever in the history of our civilization, online media is not immune from censorship and is neither free by nature nor by design. So I think this is important to note, and governments need to keep this in mind when adopting rules for the internet that might have unintended consequences. Well, finally, unrestricted access to the public domain is important for full participation of the public and civil society, for exposing injustices and bringing untold stories to light, as you said, and must not be endangered through the adoption of excessively restrictive provisions of patent and copyright laws inter alia.
Thanks. Irene, international law deals with the responsibility of states to protect freedom of speech, but we're now seeing that the private sector, and particularly these major tech companies in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, have a huge role to play as gatekeepers. So given the dominance of some of the more obvious global organizations, Facebook and others we've already mentioned, how do we address that imbalance?
Well, I'd like to draw attention to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which adopted about a decade ago. But even at that stage, I think what the guiding principles were laying out were the responsibility of governments, of the state, to protect our human rights when it comes to corporate behavior, and the responsibility of the corporate sector to respect our human rights. And that combination actually is very, very relevant when we're talking about the digital tech sector. What we see here is, interestingly enough, a lot of regulation. Either there is a lot of regulation or no regulation by states. And that's both is dangerous when it comes to digital technology, because digital technology has become an irreversible part of our freedom of expression today and is going to grow more. So overregulation can actually be very dangerous. We see that, for instance, with internet shutdowns, with governments interfering in content issues, forcing digital companies to remove certain content, etc. And that is, in a way, censorship is growing actually in the digital sector because of over-regulation by government. At the same time, we cannot simply leave it to companies. We've seen the risk of leaving it to companies, for example, in the area of disinformation, misinformation, hate speech, and so on. So what needs to happen is more regulation about transparency. Transparency should not only be enforced, it should be enhanced through regulation so that we know exactly what the rules are, how the companies are behaving. There needs to be much more exposure of that, because with transparency comes accountability, And transparency, both of the behavior of the companies, but also the behavior of the states, because very often the governments are asking certain sites to be taken down. So on both sides, there needs to be a lot more transparency to create accountability for both these two major actors. And transparency empowers users. After all, the users are the rights holders. And I think the balance needs to be set here between the duty bearers and the rights holders through transparency. Transparency is not the full answer, but it's a very important first step. And and the second issue where we are, of course, seeing a lot of interest now, both in the US and within the European Union, is about breaking the monopolies. There are monopolies in the digital tech sector, which are actually quite dangerous for human rights, for freedom of expression as well. And the third area that I want to enhance is more multi-stakeholder oversight. That is extremely important. We've seen some experiments here and there, for example, with GNI and others. And I think that the lessons from those projects need to be disseminated, understood, and multi-stakeholder control of the digital sector actually, I think, is the way forward.
Thanks, Irene. And Pedro, I wonder from your perspective, Irene was talking there about striking a particularly tricky balance between ensuring regulation doesn't restrict freedom of expression, but it also doesn't transfer more power to these giant tech companies that we're talking about. Do we want to regulate these companies? And what, in your experience, how do you think we can regulate these companies?
I would highlight first like a trend that I've seen in Latin America, and is that the users, the final users, are the weakest link of the chain of responsibility. And at the same time, it seems that a lot of the dilemmas and debates around freedom of expression online are trying to be faced and tackled by the criminalization of the final users. No, I mean, we've seen a lot of project and act bills in the region in which the focus of the limitation is how to punish or put sanctions on the final user. So I think that we have to state at least 4 principles for this, and are very match a lot with what Irene said before. The first one is we do not need excessive regulation. It's a temptation for power if we open a door to over-regulate a platform that certainly has a lot of good achievements for democracies and for free expression. The second principle is we should not have a blind faith in self-regulation. I think that the last 4 years have shown that the challenges of human rights online are not going to be resolved with a human rights perspective if we leave that in the self-regulation sphere. The third principle is, and I want to highlight it too, is transparency. There's a lack and there are a lot of gaps of information and how internet works, how the information is organized. And final users do not really know that, but they suffer the consequences of that lack of transparency. And the fourth principle is in democracy, power has to be accountable. And this includes not only a public sector, but also private sector. So in this line, multi-stakeholderism, to overview the business model. I mean, people and final users have their rights. I mean, they are not a coin, and their data is not like the trade product and with the exercise of rights. No, and also I would wrap up saying that we need a human rights sensitive solution. No, technology can be seen as in the scope of development. No, and there's a lot of debates about that. Technology can be understood in the scope of innovation, in academic field, etc., but the human rights sensitive approach, I think has to be included. And at the end, I think we have to assume that we are crossing through a very noisy atmosphere. No? And we need quality content. No? So in this WordPress Freedom Day, I have to say that we need to protect professional journalism. I think that best journalism is happening now, but unfortunately there's a lot of noise that not always let us understand that. So, and also we need societies that recognize the value of good journalism, of quality content, because poor quality content, there's a lot of internet, but the high quality one it's key for our future and for our democracies.
Thanks, Pedro. Pedro and Irene, you both mentioned accountability there, and one of the solutions that's frequently mentioned is the creation of social media councils, which many see, including Article 19, have advocated heavily for this. And social media companies need more accountability, they need more regulation. We're going to see another very quick video now, which sets out some of the complexities involved with some of that freedom of expression online.
Article 19 is proposing a new, transparent, participatory, independent and accountable mechanism to address content moderation issues on the basis of human rights standards. We call it the Social Media Council. The Council will comprise social media companies, media, journalists, bloggers, academics, civil society organisations, and other stakeholders that represent the diversity of society. Either by reviewing individual cases or elaborating guidelines, the Council will guide social media companies in applying international human rights law to their content moderation practices. Establishing a social media council at the national or global level will be complex and require determination and creativity from all participants. But it is necessary. Freedom of expression online demands transparency and accountability from social media platforms.
Jürgen, what do you think we can learn from the experiences of press and broadcasting regulations that could be applied to big tech?
Well, I mean, generally, as with basically all other technologies, when driven by political or state interest alone, there's a genuine risk that their use, like, for example, in the case of AI, has a detrimental impact on freedom of expression and media freedom. But also when driven by commercial interests alone, there is a worrying risk of seriously jeopardizing our rights. Allow me maybe at this point to do some self-promotion here. In light of the very fast-moving developments of these technologies, the OSCE representative on freedom of the media decided to put a spotlight on the connection of AI or the impact of AI on freedom of expression in our so-called SAFE project, where we focus on both content moderation and content curation. In the course of this project, we are also watching the processes in the regulation of digital companies, including the proposal and first steps of social media councils. And I will come back to this in a second. But before that, I would like to share that the incoming OSCE representative, when presenting her candidacy to the position, said that while addressing the impact of digital technologies in the media, we need to strive to minimize threats, referring to fake news, disinformation, misinformation, social split, digital divide, and to maximize opportunities, more freedom of expression, democratization of information, more civil society engagement. Our approach must remain human-centric and must pay due consideration to media literacy and artificial intelligence, algorithms regulation, as it has the power of conditioning human behavior. Nowadays, due to digital technologies, threats and challenges to freedom of expression are global in nature and highlight the need for an effective multilateral approach. This is the appropriate level to take action. She also stressed the need for a multi-stakeholder mobilization involving regulators, civil societies, and the private sector. As to whether we can learn from the experiences of press and broadcasting regulations that could be applied to big tech, I would rather leave that question open. State regulation of the press and state regulation of broadcasting, at least in the OSCE region, are two different systems. One is hardly applicable to the other, and taken alone or together, they are hardly applicable to social media. Maybe just note that the principles of regulation stay the same. They are based on Article 19 of the ICCPR and Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. but experiences are and probably should stay specific. This is also true in relation to the social media councils as a form of corporate self-regulation. And let me add one last thought to this. When we speak about dominant internet intermediaries and how their services impact media freedom of expression and media freedom, one of the biggest challenges, and here I would like to join in with Irene and Pedro, are indeed the lack of transparency and accountability of their content moderation and content curation processes. With their significant power and control over today's information ecosystem, transparent oversight is indeed crucial, but at the same time, such oversight must be truly independent and based on human rights. But having said this, an industry-wide process such as the proposed social media councils could indeed better build trust and push intermediaries towards more transparency and accountability.
Great, thanks. And great to keep some of those questions open, because we're going to the audience online now to see if we have anything from them. And I know that the team in The Hague, Pauline, have been watching closely some of the questions coming in. I wonder if there's any questions from viewers online.
Yes, absolutely. And thanks for this interesting discussion on this topic. We have some questions. The first is for either Irene or Jürgen. How to close the divide between government commitments as to press freedom in the EU, Hungary, Poland, and practice? How to enhance accountability? Either Irene or Jürgen.
Sorry, if you could just repeat the question again.
Sure. How to close the divide between government commitments as to press freedom in the EU and practice? How to enhance accountability? Can you do that, Irene? Can you answer that?
Yeah. Yes. Well, I think the human rights system is based on accountability of the state to the obligations that they take on. And that applies within the European Union as well as anywhere else in the world. And within the European Union, actually, there are multiple means of holding governments to account. Within the EU, it's a system, but also with the Council of Europe. And then, of course, at the international level, in the context of the treaty bodies and the UN Human Rights Council. And I find, for example, this month will be the first anniversary of the public inquiry that was set up for Daphne Caruana Galizia, and that's the killing of a journalist, within the European Union, who was killed 3 years ago. And there still has to be transparency, accountability for it. And then if we look at the laws that are being introduced, the statements that are being made about the integrity of the media within the European Union, I think the standards are high, and rightly so, because it's a union of values, and the European mechanisms should kick into place and take action, hold governments to account.
But do you think we're making enough progress? Are we going fast enough?
Well, I think you have pockets of problems. And those pockets of problems, you have to concentrate on them.
Jürgen?
There are many things that are happening in the European Union. I think the new legislation that is coming out on digital technology is very interesting. In some ways, the European Union is way ahead and leading the world. But in other areas, there are appalling results, and Europe has to set a role model for the rest of the world on human rights.
Jürgen, would you like to add something to that?
Well, thank you. Maybe just one thought that I could add to this is, and this is probably less from an accountability side, but I think if we look at the past months with the whole impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our societies, I think we've also seen one thing, and that is the need for reliable, pluralistic media, for professional media, for access to information, the free flow of information. And I think we've also seen how much this grew in importance for citizens in all our countries. So I think maybe not only from an accountability side, but we should probably also communicate the importance that I think everybody is feeling for the need of really having free media in our countries and have full access to this information.
Yeah, very clear. I've got a question for Pedro. How to force platforms to make their algorithm transparent if they are changed without warning and empower or silence media and individuals? Can a state achieve such transparency, or is international action necessary?
Thanks. No, I think that the actor that has taken the international commitment to protect human rights are states. No? So I think that the main responsibility of the censorship or the content moderation or all these challenges online has to be taken into account and handled by states in a way that follows international standards. The huge dilemma here in some way is that each state itself has not have the enough tools and enough information to guarantee and to solve the problems, and that's where multi-stakeholderism occurs. But also, I mean, I think that in some way we agree, and at least my office is committed with that. That power has to be accountable, that we need transparency, and that also we have to recognize that online platforms are open to that debate. No? Mm-hmm. The recent elections in the world have shown that there is a recognition of the troubles and issues of freedom of expression online. But in the other hand, I also think that, for example, we talk a lot about education and freedom of expression, digital and media literacy, but the proportion and the effort and the impact of those projects and initiatives is quite below the expectation and the need. So I think we have to mix it in these two sides. The responsibility of states as they have the duty to guarantee human rights, and the other side, what else should we do in order to have societies with enough developed skills to be aware of the issues and the quality or not quality of contents online.
And what are the tools that they should need to make this happen? What is it that they need to move forward?
Okay, I think we have discussed a lot about how to connect people. No? Okay. But we also need people and citizenship with digital abilities. That is not how to make a PowerPoint. No. That is how to be aware of privacy, how to be aware of your data, how to develop criteria to read a couple of publications and to realize which has a better quality and which is a poor quality content. I mean, we do not need to guide people to believe what we want. Mm-hmm. We need people with enough skills to take their own decisions. But the lack of transparency on internet
is the main issue.
Leave a lot of people without the basic knowledge that is needed for this. This living online.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Jürgen, a question for you. I just had a session about the online violence against female journalists. What should countries specifically do to address the safety of female journalists?
Well, we have just a couple of weeks ago published a whole new resource guide, which is basically the result of a year-long research with various partners looking into the whole issue of online violence against women, where we have tried to come up with, together with Article 9 actually, with very concrete recommendations. We have identified 10 key stakeholders from the legislative, executive, judiciary, going all the way to Muslim media outlets, training institutions, civil society, and coming up with best practice models and coming up with very concrete recommendations on how they can actually really strengthen the safe environment for female journalists when exercising this profession online. It is actually heard also in the library of the World Press Freedom Day event. So whoever is interested to look into it, you're more than invited. And I think we're very much looking forward to working exactly with all of you, because we need all those stakeholders around the table to really make these recommendations something practical in various countries. And hope that within the next 2-3 years, where we will look into the implementation of this, we'll be able to make some real difference.
Yeah. To start with the recognition of the abuse. That's step number one, I think. Pedro, is the digital divide also a gender divide? What kind of implications has this?
It is a gender divide, and also not only at the level of user, but also at the level of programming and leadership in the technology sector. I think something that could give pluralism and diversity, and I would say justice on this conversation is how to improve and how to include more women in the production of contents, in the programming sector, in the leads of media outlets. I think that the voice of women has to be heard, and certainly the male presence is still being in a wider way and with a lot of facilities that women do not have.
Yeah, I agree. And then for Jürgen, it's one of the final questions. How should governments engage with these platforms to ensure a free media environment?
Is this, sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. How should governments engage with these platforms to ensure a free media environment?
You're talking about social media platforms at the moment, yeah?
Yes.
Well, I mean, also here, this is also some ongoing work that we're looking into, where we are now trying to come up with a whole set of recommendations on how we can actually also here strengthen the governance system for social media platforms in order to increase transparency, in order to improve access to legal remedies, the whole overview over decisions. And I think this is really an area where governments and social media platforms need to work closer together.
Okay, for Irene, what mechanisms should be put in place to make sure that all perpetrators of crimes against journalists are brought to justice, for example, in South Sudan?
Well, I think around the world, we've actually seen a spike in killings. Over the last decade, more than almost 1,000 journalists have been killed, and only 1 in 10 cases actually are resolved, prosecuted, investigated. So there is clearly a gap here. Part of the gap is lack of capacity of governments like South Sudan, but a large part of it is lack of political will at the national level to investigate, because the killings are very often because of what the journalists have been investigating: corruption, mismanagement, organized crime, and so on. So I think that the international system has to be strengthened, and the international to be able to step in where governments are unwilling or unable to investigate. And I have called, together with my colleague Agnes Kalimar, the Special Rapporteur for summary executions, that there should be an international independent investigative mechanism put in place to look into the killings of journalists, a mechanism that allows special rapporteurs like myself to call on to get help, to move in quickly to see what is happening, raising awareness, throwing light on the killings, keeping the pressure on the government. At the end of the day, it is the national systems of justice that will have to be activated in most cases to make sure that there is sufficient pressure, sufficient information, sufficient evidence to shame governments to take more action. That's what I think needs to happen.
Okay. I think, Nicola, it's a perfect time to give back the floor to you for some final comments in this session.
Thanks. Yeah, I wonder, Irene and Pedro, you're both recently appointed to your roles. Maybe the audience would be interested to hear about your mandates and what your priorities are going forward.
From my perspective, I think it's very important to recognize the scope of freedom of opinion and expression. I find that support for the mandate, it tends to be missing in some parts of the world. and a greater understanding that this mandate and the rights that it is monitoring and promoting and seeking to increase protection of, these rights, the right to freedom of opinion and expression, is fundamental to both sustainable development and democracy. I think the democratic parts of it get more attention than the development part. And I would like to see, to expose more strongly the links between this mandate and the advancement of economic, social, and cultural rights. That will be one priority. The second priority, of course, is going to ensure how digital technology actually continues to be a boon for freedom of opinion and expression. It's an empowering, digital technology is very empowering. But it can also become disempowering if it is not properly managed. And that's what we've been talking about in this session. And I would like, of course, to continue to work to ensure that it is actually the benefits of digital technology are available across the world to everyone, but that they're also managed well. You know, the irony is that in those parts of the world where the digital divide is the widest, are also the parts of the world where the negative impacts are felt very brutally. For example, disinformation, misinformation, that actually impacts a lot in those places where people can only certain parts of the population have access. So enhancing the transparency of the digital system, digital literacy has been mentioned several times, making people know how to use these new forms of expression is going to be extremely important. And my third area of work will be actually enhancing greater access in an equal way and looking particularly at the role of women in this area. A feminist approach to freedom of expression is long overdue in my view.
From my side, I mean, the Office of the Special Rapporteur of the OAS has some kind of continuity. I think it's a growing from my predecessors, and I think that even when we change, the challenges is still quite the same. So violence against journalists, protection of journalism, how to tackle impunity of crimes against people that is attacked because of their free expression. But just to add another topics and the scope that I would like to have in this mandate, something that when I applied didn't expect it was the impact of the pandemic. I think we are going to be the special rapporteurs for a very weird, strange, and heavy moment of humanity. So that's something we have to, I think we have to work on. The second thing is we have to contribute for the media sector to survive. I think that we are crossing through very sensitive moments of professional journalism, and we have to contribute to that, because if truth and the professional way to tell the truth is something that is not guaranteed in our societies, the horizon for our future seems not to be the best. No? Then I also think that we have, I mean, our challenge is not how the governments sign international agreements of human rights, because they have already signed them. The challenge is how those international commitments are in practice. So in this way, I'm really worried about the attitude of political leaders around freedom of expression. We should have politicians and political leaders that welcomes pluralism, that wants diversity, but in what we're seeing is that we have political leaders denigrating, stigmatization, I mean, acuting to stigmatization, and I think that's pretty bad. And finally, education and freedom of expression. Media and digital literacy, I think it's something we have to work on.
Great, thanks. And to wrap up very quickly, it'd be great to hear from you all about, we've talked a lot about the challenges Irene mentions, we talked about solutions as well. Irene, for example, mentioned ensuring that international systems are protected and mechanisms are introduced. How do you think we can better address some of the issues that we've raised here today?
Bottom-up demand. I think we have to mobilize people. And we have seen human rights changes come when people are empowered and mobilized. So we count on organizations like Article 19 to ensure that civil society is strong and able to support us in carrying out our mandates.
In my case, I agree with that. And I would also add that we need positive leaderships in freedom of expression. There's a lot of people claiming for censorship, to be honest. And showing like good sides of censorship, and that is a tricky side of the bubbles on the internet, and that's something that we should tackle. We need an atmosphere of pluralism. We need an atmosphere that an environment that goes against discrimination, and that works on freedom of expression with a perspective of future. I mean, these dystopic times. We should put hope in somewhere, and I expect my mandate to contribute to that.
Well, maybe just to add, if you look at the OSCE mandate, I think it is very much this component of rapid reaction and then early warning that we will still need, which is pointing at where the violations are, awareness raising, and calling for accountability. But it is also the provision of assistance that we provide to our participating states, where we work together with them in order to really achieve tangible progress on some of the issues when it comes to legislation and other challenges, but also the close cooperation. And here for us, it is also very much civil society who we are counting on, because they are our most important partner in this whole endeavor, bringing things to our attention, but also working with us in terms of implementation.
Thanks. Thanks, Irene, Pedro, and Jürgen, and to everybody at home for tuning in as well. It's a real shame we couldn't be in The Hague today, but I hope that everybody found that a very wide-ranging and interesting discussion. And thanks to Pauline as well, and everybody in The Hague. I'll hand back to the studio now, and thank you to you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pedro, Irene, and of course, Jürgen, from my point of view and from the participants. And thank you, Nicola, for being such a great host and this amazing, interesting topic. Thank you very much. And yes, of course, thank you, participants, for listening to us. And let's hope that these sessions will make sure that transparency of algorithm and protecting our data and protecting the professional journalism will be the first step towards all of that, because it's needed. That's what we heard. I hope you have a wonderful day and stay safe.